The member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer explain to the House why it is important to keep taxes under control, to support a stronger economy and provide tax relief to hard-working Australians, including in the electorate of Goldstein? And is the Treasurer aware of alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Goldstein for his question. First of all, he'll be pleased to know, like everyone else on this side of the House, that there is more than 1 million extra working Australians in this country since the coalition came to government back in 2013. And those working Australians, over the next 4 years, will pay $954 billion in income tax. $954 billion in income tax. And over the next 10 years, working Australians in this country will pay more than $3,000 billion in income tax. So, Mr Speaker, I think it's the right time to have a tax plan that comes before this parliament, as was passed through this House yesterday, that provides $140 billion worth of tax relief to all working Australians, not just some, all working Australians, Mr Speaker. They're going to pay over $3,000 billion in tax, in personal taxes over the next decade, and we think it's entirely reasonable that we can bring a tax reform plan in here that deals with bracket creep, that deals with a simpler tax system. As the Prime Minister said, 94% of Australians paying no more than 32.5 cents as their marginal tax rate, dealing with immediate relief for low and middle income earners. That's what was put to the House last night. That's what was passed through this House last night. But before it was passed, what the Labor Party did was to strip away steps 2 and 3 of that plan and replace it with other measures. Now, the cost of what Labor put into the House last night and voted for was to turn a $140 billion tax relief plan into a tax plan $70 billion less. $70 billion less is the cost of the changes and the amendments that they put to that bill last night, Mr Speaker, to strip away steps 2 and 3. So they've taken a tax relief plan that is $140 billion and they've reduced it by $70 billion, Mr Speaker. That is what the Shadow Treasurer did in seeking to rip off working Australians last night. Every single one of them voted to cut that plan in half last night, Mr Speaker. And what it means is this. Over the next 10 years, we already know that the combined total of the oppressing tax burden is $220 billion, an oppressive tax burden of $220 billion. Well, last night they just jacked another $70 billion onto that, Mr Speaker. $290 billion. They wanted to turn a $140 billion tax plan into one which is just over $70 billion, Mr Speaker. And the shiftiness of it, to come into this place, say they're voting for it in the House and then say they're going to vote against it in the Senate. How can anyone believe a Labor Party that does one thing in this chamber and another thing in the other chamber, Mr Speaker? Well, unless, Mr Speaker, they want to change their tune, unless they want to tell Australians that they should get the full $140 billion.
The member for Jagga.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. What is the point of this Prime Minister and his government, given that his signature tax policy to give $80 billion to big business appears doomed? Is the Prime Minister's big business tax cut as doomed as his colleagues are claiming?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for the opportunity to respond to the members on the issue of taxation. Our side of the House, the government believes that lower, simpler, fairer, more competitive taxes is good for the economy. It's reward for effort. It actually grows the economy. That's what we believe, Mr Speaker. And as I said yesterday, when the member for Fenner, who gave us the benefit of his behavioural impacts on the tax treatment of mammals in his own references to these matters, Mr Speaker, I was mistaken to think that the Labor Party actually supported lower and fairer taxes, but I have found the reason for the apparent contradiction in the Labor Party's view on this issue, because it seems the member for Fenner is familiar with the work of Lord Layard. Now, this was brought to our attention by Ross Gittins back in April of 2005, who wrote a book, Happiness, Lessons from New Science. And drawing on studies of vervet monkeys, Mr Speaker. He concludes that we need to keep tax rates high to discourage people from working to make them happier. Eureka, the member for Fenner must have said. I've finally seen the light. Higher taxes is good for people, and they've decided to go down the path of having higher taxes, Mr Speaker. Well, I've got some advice to the member for Fenner. Stop listening to monkeys when you set tax policies, Mr Speaker.
Treasurer.